Hi folks, welcome to Christian Worldview, Module 13. This is the final session in our journey through a Christian worldview, and in this section we're going to be moving towards constructing a Christian philosophy. For this session we come back to David Naugle's book, Worldview, The History of a Concept, and quite a bit of this session actually is built up from his argument in the last part of this book. Firstly then, worldview and semiotics. Semiotics, what is semiotics? It is the study of signs and symbols as elements of communicative behaviour, the analysis of systems of communication as language, gestures or clothing. A general theory of signs and symbolism, usually divided into branches of pragmatics, semantics and syntactics. Semiotics is been a very important aspect of philosophy in the 20th century, and so it's important to look at how we regard this area and how we can think about this area of semiotics from a Christian perspective. Umberto Eco said that the whole of culture should be studied as a communicative phenomenon based on signification systems. Well, a defining trait of human beings is the ability to use one thing to stand for another thing, to section off one part of reality and employ it to refer to, mean, or stand for another part of reality. This essentially is what we do with language, but language isn't the only thing that we do this with. By these primary semiotic activities, people have been able to parse the cosmos and create maps of reality. Theologically, we can account for this with reference to the fact that we were created in the image of God, the Logos, the word in Greek, who creates by speaking. According to a Christian worldview, then, the entire universe should be conceived pansemiotically and interpreted as a sign of God and his glory and power. All creation, as I've said, has a sacramental significance, but in some sense also all of creation has a semiotic significance. It's saying something, it's declaring something to us. As Paul says in Romans chapter 1, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. The universe, in other words, is the book of God. Every part of nature possesses spiritual meaning. The totality of creation is a kind of divine iconography. Everything in this enchanted, sacramental, symbol-friendly universe is drenched with sacred signs. Secondly, then, worldview and narrative or story. Now, human beings naturally articulate their worldviews in the form of stories. Rollo May says in his book, The Cry for Myth, that myth is a way of making sense in a senseless world. Myths are narrative patterns that give significance to our existence. Whether the meaning of existence is only what we put into life by our own individual fortitude, or whether there is a meaning we need to discover, the result is the same. Myths are our way of finding this meaning and significance. May is using the word myth in the broadest possible sense as a kind of interpretive narrative for understanding our lives. Myths, he goes on, are like beams in a house, not exposed to the outside view. They are the structure which holds the house together so that people can live in it. So myth is the very structure that imparts meaning to life and thereby holds it together, according to May. In this book, Truth is Stranger Than It Used to Be, the authors point out that postmodern thinkers have striven to extirpate all meta-narratives from human thought. But this is actually deeply counterintuitive and, in a large sense, in vain. They say the very notion that in modern times we have outgrown the childish pre-scientific stage of mythical thinking and progressed to the maturity of scientific reason and technological mastery is itself a story. It is therefore only by telling its own tall tale that modernity can claim to have surpassed the need for stories. Perhaps more than any other contemporary thinker, Alasdair MacIntyre has argued most persuasively for a recovery of the narrative foundations of human existence. MacIntyre points out that because of social and philosophical forces, the narrative unity of life or of an individual life was destroyed in the context of modernity. A human self, non-narratively conceived, cannot be the bearer of Aristotelian virtues, he argues. On the contrary, a virtuous life is possible only to the extent that it is conceived, unified, and evaluated as a whole. So MacIntyre seeks to recover a concept of an integrated human existence grounded in the integrity of a narrative, which links birth, life, and death, or beginning, middle, and end, into a singular, coherent story, embraced communally, that can be assessed as such and thought about in those broad terms. Otherwise, there simply, he argues, can be no true ethics. This idea of human existence understood in terms of story is MacIntyre's primary concern. He argues that that narrative, not free-floating independent selves, is the most basic category. Stories are necessary, he argues, to make sense of one's own life and the lives of others. He says in his book After Virtue, there is no way to give us an understanding of any society, including our own, except through this stock of stories, which constitute its initial dramatic resources. Mythology, in its original sense, is at the heart of things. Now again, I'll just point out that mythology, this use of this term myth and mythology, doesn't mean something necessarily fictional. It's this broad sense of myth is this idea of a story that gives meaning, kind of a big picture, to life. He continues, a central thesis then begins to emerge. Man is, in his actions and practice, as well as in his fictions, essentially a storytelling animal. He is not essentially, but becomes through his history a teller of stories that aspire to truth. But the key question for men is not about their own authorship. I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part? Human life is governed by story. The roles which people play, how they understand themselves and others, how the world itself is structured and operates, are a function of the narrative plots that reign in a human community. Middleton and Walsh point out that both Judaism and Islam articulate their worldview in narrative form, appealing to the destiny of history as revelatory of God's intent. Even Eastern religions such as Hinduism and Buddhism, they say, which are often portrayed as suspicious of history, have passed on a rich heritage of myths in storied form, including an epic narrative, the Mahabharata, of which the Bhagavad Gita is part. Myths and folk tales of good, evil, and redemption are also the stock in trade of the contemporary indigenous religions of Africa, North and South America, and Australia, as well as the classical religions of Greece, Rome, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. In each case, ultimate truths about the world, humanity, evil, and salvation are communicated in terms of stories, which give guidance and set the parameters for ethical action. Now, it's worth noting, of course, that the largest part of the Bible actually is made up of narrative. It's made up of history, of the stories of God and his interaction with people. And this is really notable. We are part of a grand narrative. And in a sense, this is how our theology, in a sense, comes to us in narrative form. And I think this is a real key, actually, to being able to communicate our faith and even defend our faith. As is pointed out by Alister McGrath in his book, Narrative Apologetics. He says here, one of the difficulties facing an apologist is that demonstrating the reasonableness or truth of Christianity does not always lead people to embrace it. Something may be true, yet possess little, if any, relevance for human existence. Truth, he says, is no guarantor of relevance. Veracity is one thing, indeed a good thing. Existential traction, however, is something very different. It is indeed, he says, important to show that there are good historical and rational grounds for Christian belief, yet this is in itself quite inadequate to demonstrate that Christianity is capable of changing people's lives, giving them meaning and hope so that they can cope with a deeply puzzling and disturbing world. It presents Christianity as something external that is to be confirmed, not as something internal that is to be experienced. There is a danger, he says, that apologetics becomes fixated on questions about the historical reliability of the Bible, and in doing so fails to set out its powerful vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. To offer a historical explanation of an event is to tell its story, thus providing a narrative structure that allows beliefs, actions, and attitudes to be related to one another in a meaningful way. This kind of narrative makes history both intelligible and interesting by providing a framework of connection between motives, events, circumstances, and contingencies. Now, there's an important point to be made here. McGrath says, yes, the Christian narrative is about explanation, but only in part. Focusing solely on the explanatory virtues of Christianity can, as Marilyn Robinson rightly points out, too easily lead to it being seen as a crude explanatory system, an attempt to do what science actually could do, that is, account for the origins and workings of things. And if that is allowed to happen, McGrath continues, defenders of the gospel will treat it as battling science for the same terrain, rather than focusing on what is distinct and characteristic about the Christian faith. The explanatory capacity of the gospel is an undeserved and gracious gift, yet the real business of the gospel is about human transformation, not merely helping us to make sense of things. I think McGrath makes a really good point here, and already in previous sessions I've showed how a number of things like the problem of evil can actually be framed well within the story of the Bible, and this, I think, is the best way to do this. So it's very important that we remember that that narrative is a very central part of the Christian faith, and the way in which theology is presented is very much as a story. Worldview and reason. Let's have a look at a Christian worldview perspective on reason. Well, let's begin with an important question. What influence, if any, does a worldview have on the way reason works and what it says? Is rationality dependent upon or free from a semiotic or narrative context? Is there an arc kind of rationality transcending worldviews that is homogeneous and the same for all? Well, Enlightenment thinkers sought out a purely objective way of knowing. They submitted all propositions to the bar of dispassionate reason. They demanded that all claims to truth pass empirical standards, and they apportioned all epistemic judgments according to the evidence. Alister McIntyre, again in his book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, says, so it was hoped reason would displace authority and tradition, that is in the Enlightenment. Rational justification was to appeal to principles undeniable by any rational person, and therefore independent of all those social and cultural particularities which the Enlightenment thinkers took to be the mere accidental clothing of reason in particular times and places. But is the modern version of rationality truly rational? Well, the problem here is that Enlightenment thinkers couldn't agree on what propositions constituted an indubitable foundation of reason. It seemed that the subjective perspective is inescapable. R.G. Collingwood makes a really important point about rationality in his essay on metaphysics. He says rationality inheres in a logic of question and answer, which is related to a series of relative and absolute presuppositions. Relative presuppositions, he argues, consist of the answer to a previous question, which in turn becomes the basis for the next question. And the whole system of question and answer arises from and is dependent upon a set of absolute presuppositions that fosters the system of thought in the first place. Absolute presuppositions themselves are not subject to proof or disproof. People argue from, but not to, presuppositions. So Collingwood's doctrine of the absolute presuppositions, which approximates basically to the function of a Weltanschauung or a worldview, supports the argument that rationality does not function abstractly, but rather it functions by commitment, and in this case, a commitment to a set of absolute presuppositions. Now, this connects us then with Cornelius Van Til's presuppositional apologetics. He says, and he argues that God's self-revelation acts as the absolute presupposition. We can only argue from our worldview. We cannot argue to it, is his point. Well, let's turn now to worldview and hermeneutics. And hermeneutics, of course, is the art of interpretation. And hermeneutics has been a big area of philosophy again, particularly in the last 50 years. So let's see if we can look at a Christian view of hermeneutics. Aristotle said that all instruction given or received by way of argument proceeds from pre-existent knowledge. The explanation of texts always proceeds on the basis of various pre-understandings and governing commitments. The process of interpretation, like reason, is guided by prejudices and is tradition-bound. It rests ultimately on worldview. Interpretation, therefore, is an inescapable component to human existence. We never just have bare facts. They are always facts interpreted through the lens of our worldview. Martin Heidegger argues that humanity is not a detached observer of the cosmos seeking to analyze and control it. Rather, humanity is thoroughly grounded in being and time, and these existential involvements establish a forestructure of understanding by which the world is interpreted. Hans-Georg Gadamer, in his book Truth and Method, says, what appears to be a limiting prejudice from the viewpoint of the absolute self-construction of reason, in fact belongs to historical reality itself. If we want to do justice to man's finite historical mode of being, it is necessary to fundamentally rehabilitate the concept of prejudice and acknowledge the fact that there are legitimate prejudices. And of course, this was Kierkegaard's argument. According to Kierkegaard, objectivity is absolutely impossible. That is in the grand sort of philosophical questions, and certainly in terms of interpreting any kind of facts, even within science. Of course, he would commend the idea of being a detached observer as a sort of a methodological goal, but in a real sense, this is absolutely impossible. And he wanted to point this out because this idea of the detached observer was actually taken quite literally, and people thinking that this is indeed possible. And he points out, no, it's absolutely impossible. And in fact, what Kierkegaard argued is that truth is not attained by sort of objective observation of bare facts. No, truth is the right kind of subjectivity. It is, as Hans-Georg Gadamer says, it is the right kind of prejudice. Now, in the postmodern world, of course, after Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, all human traditions are viewed with a hermeneutic of suspicion. According to this postmodern view, human communities are self-reflexive social and linguistic constructions consisting of conventions to be suspected, interests to be unmasked, myths to be exploded, power relations to be short-circuited, and meanings to be deconstructed. Now, certainly, while discernment is, of course, important, such radical suspicion leads naturally only to nihilism. The Bible, as part of this sort of spirit of the age, if we can use that term, has then been subjected to a devastating hermeneutic of suspicion. And methodologically, this is really a problem. This is what's behind the more hypercritical view of the Bible. It's essentially based on a hermeneutic of suspicion. There's nothing objective about it. The rule is doubt everything, and if you can find something to doubt, then doubt it. So this is a very unfortunate way of doing scholarship, particularly biblical scholarship. Well, the challenge that comes particularly from Kierkegaard's work is, what about a hermeneutic of trust? I think the hermeneutic of suspicion doesn't really get us anywhere, in the sense when you begin with doubt, it's cyclical. You will always end up by finding something to doubt. If you want to find something to doubt, you will find it in the Bible. And so a hermeneutic of trust is something that enables us actually to connect with what the Bible is saying and actually see that it's true, in a sense, from the inside. And that's the way that Kierkegaard was wanting us to discover the truth. Well, then finally, worldview and epistemology. Let's look at epistemology, the theory of knowledge from a Christian worldview perspective. The question that it's posed in modern philosophy, beginning with Descartes, is the question, how do I know that the world outside my mind is real? This, of course, was Descartes' project, and we've looked at Descartes as well, in order to find what he felt was a solid basis for knowledge, which he felt could only be based on reason. But the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid takes issue with the whole endeavour of Descartes. He says, "Let scholastic sophisters entangle themselves in their own cobwebs. I am resolved to take my own existence and the existence of other things upon trust, and to believe that snow is cold and honey sweet, whatever they may say to the contrary. He must either be a fool or want to make a fool of me, that would reason me out of my reason and senses." A common sense judgment is, according to Reid, necessary to all men for their being and preservation, and therefore it is unconditionally given to all men by the author of nature. In a sense, Reid kind of founds his philosophy upon the same foundation that Descartes ends up with in the end, but Reid doesn't want to go through that whole process that Descartes does. He doesn't even think that the question and particularly the methodology of Descartes is valid. He certainly doesn't want to start with a methodology of doubt. He wants to begin with a methodology of trust. Now, in terms of epistemology, the key question that we pose from a Christian worldview perspective is, how do I know God? This is a very important question. Well, to begin to answer this, let's go back to a bit of classical epistemology and talk about the noetic structure of the mind. The noetic structure of the mind is kind of the family tree of ideas, how ideas are formed. And of course, all ideas go back to what are referred to as properly basic beliefs. Properly basic beliefs are those bits of knowledge upon which all of our other ideas are based. The philosopher Bertrand Russell argues that a belief is only reasonable if it is either a properly basic belief or a belief that can be shown by logical deduction to be based upon a properly basic belief. Well, this in turn raises the question, so which beliefs are properly basic? Well, the classical approach, and this view is known as classical foundationalism, is that there are only two types of properly basic beliefs. There are sensory beliefs and self-evident beliefs. Sensory beliefs are impressions on the mind resulting from some form of sensory perception. So sensory beliefs this is properly basic knowledge that we get through our senses. Okay, so that I see a chair over there is something which I cannot doubt, nor do I need to prove. It's just simply there. Okay, so that's one sort of properly basic beliefs, the knowledge that we receive through our senses. Then there are self-evident beliefs. Now this is as in mathematics. So that 2 + 3 = 5 is also not something that I can doubt. It simply is. That every effect has a cause is another proposition that I cannot doubt. These are properly basic beliefs. Now, the classical foundationalist assumption actually created a whole field of apologetics, a field of apologetics designed to show that we can prove the existence of God based on what we see through our senses and the use of reason. So, this view, and this was the view of Aquinas, is that we can, we can build knowledge of God, or knowledge of God comes through these kinds of beliefs are properly basic. However, the question has been raised in particular by Alvin Plantinga, and this gave rise to what's known as Reformed epistemology, about classical foundationalism, and whether in fact classical foundationalism, that assumption that there are only two types of properly basic beliefs, whether that is in fact true. And I think this is, this is an important question. Plantinga says, I'm interested in the claim that it is irrational or unreasonable to accept theistic belief in the absence of evidence or reasons. Why suppose that is true? Why should we think a theist must have evidence or reason to think that there is evidence if he is not to be irrational? Why not suppose instead that he is entirely within his epistemic rights in believing in God's existence, even if he has no argument or evidence at all? Now, Plantinga's argument is referred to as Reformed epistemology because it actually goes back to John Calvin. John Calvin and the Reformed epistemologists argue that there is something in the way that God originally created man that enables him to know God innately. This leads to an altogether different account of the noetic structure by which rationality is defined, and thus to an altogether different account of rationality. This is the crux of Reformed epistemology. Plantinga points out that the classical foundationalist claim on rationality is itself without foundation. So, whereas in classical foundationalism you have only two types of properly basic beliefs, that is sensory beliefs and self-evident beliefs, Plantinga wants to call this into question. Why assume that classical foundationalism is correct? Perhaps there could be another kind of properly basic belief, and this indeed is Plantinga's argument. Well, he argues that the connection between the truth placed in us by God and the truth that is in God is not a logical one, but a spiritual one. So Plantinga adds to the two types of properly basic beliefs that the classical foundationalists affirm, he adds a third kind of properly basic belief, namely innate beliefs. That is, beliefs that we are born with, that are given to our minds a priori. They are generally held beliefs shared by all human beings, and they are a matter of immediate, as it says, innate knowledge. So this is Reformed epistemology, that there are three kinds of properly basic beliefs: sensory beliefs, self-evident beliefs, and innate beliefs. And belief in God is understood to be of the third kind of, it is a kind of innate belief. This, for Plantinga, puts the burden of proof upon those who wish to deny belief in God. Okay, but one problem arises here is that if the knowledge of God is indeed innate, well, then why is there such a thing as atheism? Doesn't seem that it's that obvious to everyone. Well, the answer, of course, is in Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, Paul makes the point that all people know God. Now, he says here that they know God because it is evident in God's creation. Reformed epistemologists, though, make the point that it is evident only because there is something innate within us that enables us to actually recognize the created world as the work of God. But what the point that Paul makes in Romans chapter 1 is that although they knew God, they actually suppressed this knowledge because they wanted to live autonomously and independently of God and to pursue their own ends. And so, yes, there is this knowledge, but it has been suppressed. And of course, this is the origin of idolatry. Idolatry is essentially a diminishment of God. It's diminishing God to something essentially user-friendly or distant or something, but certainly something that enables people to get on and live the lives that they want to live. And often a lot of the pagan gods that have been invented are very much the image of rebellious humanity in the gods themselves. John Calvin said, "But though experience testifies that a seed of religion is divinely sowed in all, scarcely 1 in 100 is found who cherishes it in his heart, and not one in whom it grows to maturity, so far is it from yielding fruit in its season. Moreover, while some lose themselves in superstitious observances and others of set purpose wickedly revolt from God, the result is that, in regard to the true knowledge of him, all are so degenerate that in no part of the world can genuine godliness be found." At this point, I'll refer back to what I'm going to call the existential problem of knowledge. This is part of that propensity in human beings to suppress the knowledge of God, and this is perhaps a manifestation of it. There is a propensity in our God complex to want to make an object of God that can be the subject of our study, where we think about God and try to grasp God and treat God as something like an object in some sense. And so this comes back to the subject-object problem and the way that human beings try to relate to the world and even the things of God in a kind of subject-object relationship, so that we become kind of God standing outside of reality, looking in and making judgments about what's true and what's not true and what's good and what's bad and so forth. It's the classic result of the eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which temptation came about from human beings wanting to be God. That was the original temptation. And so there's this kind of God complex, even expressed in an epistemological sense. This is the symptom that we feel when we want God to be proven to us before we'll believe, because we've got to grasp it. We've got to kind of stand in relation to that proposition as an object, as an intellectual object, and kind of see that it's correct from that objective point of view. That's part of the God complex in human beings as well, and this is something that was really the subject of a lot of Kierkegaard's writings and of his critique of previous philosophy. Of course, that is impossible because we are inside existence, and we cannot take that really divine point of view. We can't stand outside of existence and look in. And the only way that we can really know a true epistemology is the right kind of subjectivity, as Kierkegaard pointed out. And so we can only really know ultimate reality and ultimate truth from within. You can't know it from the outside. And so there's a decision to be made, and it's the unwillingness to make that decision of faith, to let God be God and to relate to God as God, that shuts us out essentially, or from the knowledge of God, in the sense that we suppress that knowledge through our God complex. Well, I've talked about this existential problem before, and I think this is really the crux of the problem when it comes to a biblical epistemology. The problem is not that we don't know or that we can't know. The problem is a matter of the will. It's that we don't want to know. There's a defensiveness in human beings, because to know God is to know that God is God, and to know that we are not God. And in our God complex, we naturally shut this knowledge out. And so there is a corruption of human beings, even in an epistemological sense. And this brings us back to the problem of sin, and it brings us back to the need for salvation and for Jesus Christ that is at the centre of the Christian faith. Well, that then concludes this module of Christian Worldview, and indeed that concludes this course. I hope you have enjoyed the journey. Blessings.